Chapter 8 is The Last Night. Don't you believe it? It's not the last. There are 2 more chapters after this. And one evening is where we are now. And the butler, Poole, arrives to visit him. And he says, Mr Utterson, there is something wrong. I think we've gathered by now there's something wrong, haven't we? Anyway, what are you afraid of? I've been afraid for about a week, he says, but getting more time. He says, I think there's been foul play. Now, foul play is an expression that comes into English through Shakespeare, actually, but it begins to be used to mean murder and death and mystery in the novels of Wilkie Collins. And it's said 3 times. I think there's been foul play, said Poole. Foul play, cried the lawyer. What foul play? Now, I think we're beginning to get echoes of Shakespeare here. Because you might remember, or you might not, Hamlet, when the ghost tells Hamlet there's been murder. Murder? Murder most foul. I think now Stevenson is beginning to relish it and give us echoes of Shakespeare. We're going to get a few more echoes of Shakespeare as we go through. So the only thing he can do is go and see for himself. And guess what the weather was like? Symbolically, it was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March. So time has been moving on. And a pale moon, look at the personification of the moon here, it's lovely, lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and a flying rack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. Isn't that amazing? These sudden, beautiful glimpse of the moon. It seemed to have swept the streets bare of passengers. Never in his life had he been so conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures. He has that wish to touch people, which is an anticipation of calamity. And he's ratcheting up the tension here. He's turning the screw, the calamity. God grant there be nothing wrong, says Poole. And they enter in, the servants let them in. And we get a whole bunch of servants here. Are you all here? Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased. They're all afraid, says Poole. And the maid begins to weep loudly. Hold your tongue. Very nice little domestic scene of all the servants being agitated, adding a touch of domesticity to the horror that is building up. And, oh, they're worried. And he goes all the way down to this termination. He says, he follows the butler into the laboratory building, through the surgical theatre with its lumber of crates and bottles, and he stands and listens. So you've got to go through the long, dark tunnels, down into the laboratory. All of this is a very Gothic sort of creation of interior atmosphere. And Poole cries, Mr Utterson, sir, asking to see you. Tell him I cannot see anyone. Thank you, sir. Don't you love the way the butler still calls him sir, even though the guy's losing his mind? It seems much changed, the voice. I've been 20 years in this man's house. Even the voice has changed. Did you notice the hand, the autograph, the signature, the writing had changed? Now the voice is changed. This is very strange, Poole. He's been crying night and day because, and here we flash forward to the 20th century drug withdrawal phenomenon. This is one of the first cases, not the first, but one of the first cases in which you get drug withdrawal symptoms. He's desperate to get this drug from some kind of pharmacy that will make some kind of difference to his condition. and he's sending Poole out to get it, and he's not getting it, and he's getting the wrong stuff, and da. It's a drug withdrawal symptoms, cold turkey sort of syndrome. Very, very 20th century, 1886. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir. Anytime I bring it, he complains about it because it's not pure. And there's yet another note, and this is the note to the chemist, saying he wants this drug. Find me some of the old stuff. And the chemist called Mose. The man at Mose was main angry, so he threw it back to me like so much dirt. And they recognise the handwriting. Handwriting is always important here. But what matters the handwriting? I've seen him. I came into the theatre of the garden, and he said, Poole saw the man in the garden, in the courtyard, and he was wearing a mask. How 20th century are we getting now? He's turning into all sorts of super creatures, super horror, cross between Batman and Hannibal Lecter here. Strange, strange circumstances, but I think I begin to see daylight. Your master is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. And he's beginning to think of it as an illness. He still hasn't clocked that Jekyll is Hyde. You've got to be aware of that. He's trying, with a lawyer's mind and no imagination, he's trying to rationalize, ratiocinate the malady of the doctor. And that's his explanation. My master, however, says Poole, is tall and fine built. The guy he saw with the mask was a dwarf. Ugh. From the beginning of the story to the end, the idea is always that Jekyll is tall, elegant, charming, and Hyde is always small and kind of lame and misshapen, deformed. First time I think they've used the word dwarf. It sounds to me as if he's getting smaller and smaller as he goes on. The thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. It was never Dr. Jekyll. It is the belief of my heart that there was murder done. Utterson is wondering, because he's got this note and the handwriting again. I shall consider my duty to break in the door. Eventually they decide they're going to break in the door. And conveniently, there's an axe in the theatre. Well, yeah, as you would always have an axe in the theatre, and you might take the kitchen poker. And so they're going to break in the door. All right. And here we get the realization. It was Mr. Hyde, they think. Have you ever met with this Mr. Hyde? Yes, said Utterson. I once spoke with him. I'm a book-learned man, and a man has his feelings, but that was Mr. Hyde. And the lawyer says, my fears incline to the same point. Evil, I fear, founded. Evil was sure to come of this connection. And they summon a footman, whose name happens to be Bradshaw, like the train timetables. And they send him and the footman round to the back. Again, a very cinematic trick. If they're going to break the door down, all the police stories you ever saw on the telly or read about, if you're going to break in the front door, you've got to have somebody guarding the back. Stevenson's quick here. He's got the idea. A lovely line. The scud had banked over the moon, and it was now quite dark. So that beautiful moon has now been darkened. Symbolic weather. And Poole begins to talk about the creature in the room, as if it was a creature. And I remember Frankenstein, the creature was called the creature, and he calls it it. It will walk all day and the better part of the night. The only break is when the chemist sends another sample, but then it's not enough. Is there never anything else? Once I heard it weeping. It. So the creature in the room, Jekyll, Hyde, has been dehumanized, if you like. And that's not Jekyll's voice. It's Hyde's, cried Utterson. Done with the door, Poole. And they break in the door the way you do. Now look at the next line. Page 44 in this edition. A dismal screech, as of mere animal terror, rang from the room. And they break down the door at the fifth attempt, the big solid door. And the most commonplace, the quietest room you would have said that night in London, but right in the midst lay the body of a man, sorely contorted and still twitching. And as if it was an insect, a cockroach on the floor, they creep up to it, they turn it over. Think of a cockroach, little legs there. And it was the face of Edward Hyde. There. Dressed in clothes that are too big for him. And we've come too late. Hyde has gone to his account. And the door is locked. Poole stamps him. He must be buried here. They're looking now for Jekyll, because nowhere was there any trace of Jekyll, dead or alive. Now, of course, they think there is still a Jekyll around. He may have fled. He turned to examine the door by the street. It was locked. And lying nearby on the flags, they found the key, already stained with rust. This does not look like use. Use? Do you not see, sir? It's broken, much as if a man had stamped on it. Now, keys have been important all the way through. Remember this key, because in the final reckoning of the story, that key, we're going to get the explanation of it. We're getting more and more mysterious. And, of course, they find his books, annotated in his own hand, the mirror, the cheval glass, which was mentioned before, and which will be mentioned again later. We're going to get all of these elements coming back. Poole says one of the great lines of the whole novel. He says, "This glass has seen some strange things, sir, and surely none stranger than itself," echoed the lawyer. For what could Jekyll want with it? The mirror. And of course the business table and a large envelope. Here we go again. Letters. The lawyer unsealed it and several enclosures fell to the floor, which was careless of him. But in the place of the name of Edward Hyde, this is a new will, he read the name of Gabriel John Utterson. Edward Hyde has left everything. And this is millions, remember, to Utterson. It's a bit like Robinson Crusoe. At the end of the novel, Robinson Crusoe, having gone through 30-something years on the island, he comes back and he finds himself a rich man. Utterson, at the end of this story, is the guy who makes all the money. Funny that. I think there's a little joke in there about lawyers always making money out of everybody's misery. I don't know if Stevenson intended that joke or if it's just me seeing it. And Poole says to him, "Are you going to read it?" And he says, "Can't be reading so many letters and they're all so bloody nasty. What's going to happen?" And here's the final letter of Henry Jekyll. "My dear Utterson, when this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared. Under what circumstances I have not the penetration to foresee, but my instinct in all circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then and first read the narrative which Lanyon warned me he was to place in your hands, And if you care to hear more, turn to the Confession of Henry Jekyll. There was a third enclosure here, and he gave a big packet. Don't say anything, don't say anything. They went out, they locked the door of the theatre behind them, using quite what as a key we don't really know. And Utterson trudged back to his office to read the two narratives in which this mystery was now to be explained. And that's the end of the 8th chapter.